On the evening of December 29, 1986, a California Highway Patrol officer named Craig Pyre drove his cruiser down Interstate 15 in San Diego, California. With him was an NBC News reporter in the back seat, and there was a cameraman in the passenger seat. They were filming a segment about highway travel safety that was set to air on the evening news later that night. Officer Pyre was following his typical patrol route, but after a few minutes, they passed by a sign that said Mercy Road. It was an exit. And at that point, Officer Pyre turned to the news team, pointed at Mercy Road, and said, "That's where they found the body." So a little more than 36 hours earlier, at around 4 a.m. the previous morning, a 20-year-old college student named Kara Knott had been found strangled to death in a creek right near the Mercy Road exit. Kara had been on her way home from her boyfriend's house when, for whatever reason, maybe car troubles or maybe she was trying to help someone, but she wound up in that cul-de-sac, and then while she was there, she clearly encountered someone dangerous who took her life. And so this was actually why the California Highway Patrol and NBC News were collaborating on this news segment, because Kara's killer was still not caught. And so the idea behind this segment was basically to tell drivers along this highway, how to stay safe while they were out there, especially if for whatever reason they had to stop somewhere along the highway, what to do in that situation. And so as Officer Pyre passed by the Mercy Road exit and continued down Interstate 15, he turned to the news crew, and as they filmed, he began talking about the basics of highway travel safety. Specifically, he said, look, one of the most hazardous things that can happen to you beyond an accident on the highway is if you have some sort of car trouble that forces you to stop on the highway. Because once you stop, there's an inclination for a lot of people to want to leave their vehicle. But that's a very dangerous thing to do.
Anything could happen. Being a female, you could be raped, robbed if you're a male, all the way to where you could be killed.
Officer Pyre also warned people not to get into a stranger's car, because there was a running theory at this point that perhaps Kara had gotten into her killer's car. As this particular segment was filmed, the one you just watched, Officer Pyre was looking ahead, and he noticed there was a car pulled over on the shoulder of the highway with its hazards on. So he turned to the news crew and basically said, look, here's a chance for us to actually show the people in real time what to do in case your car breaks down on the highway. So he pulled his cruiser over right behind the stalled car, he got out, and then gestured for the news crew to come with him. Officer Pyre walked over to the passenger side door of this car, and through the open window, he asked the driver to get out and talk to him. The driver did, and as the camera rolled, Officer Pyre asked him to explain, what's going on here, what happened to your car. The driver said he had run out of gas and then gotten stranded on the side of the road. And then he had left his car and walked to a gas station to get a gas can, came all the way back, he put the gas into his car, but his car still wouldn't start. Now, at this point, Officer Pyre is realizing that this driver is doing basically exactly what he shouldn't be doing, according to the safety tips Officer Pyre had given. And so on camera, he basically says to this guy, do you understand how dangerous it is to have left your car like that and walked alone on this highway? Do you understand what a hazard that is? And the driver just kind of looked at him and shrugged yeah, I guess so. After that, Officer Pyre called the man a tow truck. His car was towed and the man was on his way. And Officer Pyre got back into the cruiser with the news crew and they carried on. After that, Officer Pyre and the news crew wrapped up filming. And then after he dropped them back off again, they told him what time to expect his segment to air on NBC that night. And sure enough, that evening, Officer Pyre was in front of a TV as the broadcast started. And when Officer Pyre's actual segment aired on TV, to him and to the California Highway Patrol, it went great. It was 1.5 minutes long. It sort of hit all the high points. It showed Officer Pyre, talking about how to be safe on the highway and talking to the stranded motorist. It kind of did exactly what they expected it to do. And when it was over, Officer Pyre clicked off the TV and didn't think much about it, because it was not a big deal. It was just a basic safety video. And for the vast majority of other people who watched this clip live on TV, it really didn't stand out to them. Again, it was just kind of a routine police safety video. But there were a few people, when they watched this clip, that noticed something very specific. And within an hour of this clip airing on TV, those few people were calling the police in droves to tell them, we know what happened to Kara Knott. And the police would follow up on these tips. And sure enough, just over 2 weeks later, they had gathered enough evidence that they were able to arrest Kara Knott's killer. It would turn out all the clues the police needed to solve the Kara Knott murder case were right there in that 1.5 minute long video. Because what happened to Kara had almost happened to over 24 other women in San Diego. And those young women were the ones who saw the news segment when it happened live, and they noticed this particular detail that clearly telegraphed who Kara's killer was. They were the ones who called police. On the night of Kara's murder, December 27, 1986, she pulled off Interstate 15 on the Mercy Road exit, and she came to a stop in that cul-de-sac. Now, we don't know exactly why she came to a stop in there, but either way, she was there, and that's where she encountered her killer. Now, the other 24 women who encountered the same person, the killer, they were terrorized and kind of tortured and held hostage for a couple of hours, but eventually were let go. But Kara wasn't. During her encounter, at some point, the killer clubbed her over the head and then strangled her to death with a rope. Now, the killer, at first, had gotten away with this, until they were featured on that 1.5-minute long video. And some of those women who had survived their attack, they're watching the segment, and suddenly their attacker is on TV. Now, they had previously reported their attack to police, but to this point, nothing had been done. And now they're staring at, for sure, the person who attacked them, who's right on TV. And critically, as part of this segment, they're hearing about how this other young woman had been attacked and killed on this highway. And they're thinking, oh, this person did that to me. I barely got away. I bet they killed this girl. And on top of that, as they're watching the news, staring at their attacker, they can see there's a fresh cut over their eye. And so put that all together and they thought, boom, that's the person who killed Karen Otts. And sure enough, the police would follow up on these tips and they would confirm that the man in the video with the cut over his eyebrow was Kara's killer. And Kara's killer was none other than Officer Craig Pyre. Officer Pyre was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Since being incarcerated, he has gone up for parole 2 separate times and been rejected both times. However, he is up for parole again in 2027. Around 1 p.m. on November 28, 1979, a 52-year-old tour guide named Peter Mulgrew stood at the front of the cabin of Air New Zealand flight TE901. Out the window next to him, he looked out and he saw this vast white landscape reflecting the afternoon sun. And so he grabbed the microphone and announced to the 237 passengers that they were now flying over Antarctica. The passengers got really excited and immediately pulled out their cameras and began snapping photos left and right. And as you can see from some of the photos that they took, a lot of the passengers actually got up out of their seats and moved around to get the best angle of the ground down below. Now, on a normal commercial flight, that behavior would not be okay. You can't just, wander all around the cabin. You need to basically stay seated. But this was not a normal commercial flight. This was a sightseeing flight. Air New Zealand regularly took off from New Zealand and would fly people up over Antarctica, and their tour guide would point out a few landmarks down below, and then that flight would land back in New Zealand. That was the whole thing. It was just a chance to go out and see Antarctica and take photos. Peter had been a tour guide for this flight many times before, and so he knew what to expect. He not only knew kind of how passengers react, but he also knew exactly when to look out which side of the plane to get the best view. And so after a couple of minutes, he called out to the passengers, hey, if you look out the left side of the plane, you'll get a great view of the coast of Antarctica. And so all the passengers, they immediately get up and shift over to the left side of the plane and they press their cameras up against the glass, they're taking photos. And then a couple of minutes later, Peter called out to the group again and said, okay, now look out the right side where you'll see Mount Erebus, this huge, stunning mountain. Now, Peter was accustomed to people gasping when they saw this mountain because it was so beautiful, so enormous. And as people piled up against the right side and began taking photos, that's what he heard. People were gasping. But then at the same time, the plane suddenly jolted hard, and one of those passengers on the right side took this photo. As you can see, there are black marks on the window, and these black marks are believed to be either engine oil or soot from Mount Erebus. Because Mount Erebus was not just some mountain. Mount Erebus was an active volcano, and the flight path of TE901 was supposed to have them going safely around Mount Erebus to get a nice full view of the volcano. But mistakes were made, and before the pilots could correct them, the plane flew directly into the volcano. And so this photo you're looking at almost certainly was taken literally at the moment of impact. a crash that resulted in 237 lives lost. The crash of Flight TE901 was the worst aviation disaster in New Zealand history, and as a result, Air New Zealand no longer offers those sightseeing flights. At 5:30 a.m. on July 16, 1945, a 13-year-old girl named Barbara Kent was sleeping inside of a cabin in Ruidoso, New Mexico, where she was staying for a sleepover summer dance camp. And as she slept, suddenly there was this loud booming sound that literally shook her awake and actually caused her to fall out of her bed onto the floor. Barbara sat up, feeling totally confused, and she looked around the cabin and she saw the 9 other girls that were also here for the sleepover camp. They too were wide awake, and some of them also had fallen onto the floor. And so the girls, they're all freaking out. They're looking at each other like, what's going on here? What was that? And as this kind of pandemonium is ensuing, their lead dance instructor came running into the cabin and told the girls that she thought one of the cabin's heaters had exploded and that potentially there could be a fire somewhere on the camp. And so all the girls, they're already totally panicked. Now they're getting really scared. And the instructor's just like, all right, girls, go outside, stand by the river. I'm gonna go find wherever this explosion happened and make sure everything is okay. And so the girls, they were led outside, totally a mess, and they went and stood by this river near the cabin and waited for their instructor to go look around. And so Barbara and the 9 other girls, they're totally terrified, and they're standing by this riverbank, and they're kind of looking around the property, seeing if they can see smoke or fire, but they can't. And as they're standing there waiting for their instructor to come back, Barbara felt something hit the tip of her nose, and it was cold and soft. And she looked up and she realized it was snowing. But it's July in New Mexico. It should not be snowing. But sure enough, snow was coming down from the sky. And as the snow came down on Barbara, she looked at the other girls, and they too were looking up and putting their hands up and letting the snow hit them in the face. They couldn't believe it. I mean, this was like a totally rare weather event. And so a minute later, their dance instructor came back and told the girls that, she looked all over the camp and there did not appear to be a fire or an explosion of any kind, that everything seemed fine. They didn't know what that loud sound was, but by all accounts, it seemed safe here. And so the girls were very relieved to hear this, but already their attention had completely shifted to the snow. I mean, again, it's July in New Mexico. There shouldn't be snow. And so the girls, they turned to their instructor and they're like, okay, well, now that it's safe, would it be okay if we put on our bathing suits and just went swimming in the river while it snowed on us? I mean, this is incredible. And the instructor, who to this point had really been focused on finding the fire and the hazard or whatever, now that she knew things were safe, she kind of took in the scene and also suddenly appreciated how unbelievable it was that there was snow coming down. And so she told the girls, yeah, get your bathing suits, go swimming, enjoy this. This is totally like a once in a lifetime moment here. And so very excitedly, Barbara and the other girls ran back into the cabin, they changed into their swimwear, and then a moment later, they were out frolicking in the river as the snow fell on top of them. And for hours, they just played in the river and enjoyed the snow. And the snow was kind of building up on the riverbanks, and so some of the girls went over and scooped it up and rubbed it on their faces and made snowballs, and they just had a great time. And at one point, the dance instructor came by and actually took a picture of Barbara, who was right in the middle of the river enjoying this bizarre scene. But eventually, despite how fun the snow was, the novelty of it all sort of wore off, and the girls got tired of swimming, so they changed into their regular clothes and went about their day. And over the course of the next few days, summer camp went as normal. The girls had a great time, and when summer camp ended, all the girls went home. Now, the girls never got an explanation for why it had snowed. They all just assumed it was some super rare weather event that they had been lucky enough to experience. Until 17 years later, when Barbara was 30 years old at this point, and she learned that all the other girls she had gone to the dance camp with had died. One by one, each of those girls were diagnosed with aggressive forms of cancer that killed them. Barbara was the only one who was spared. And she wouldn't get any clarification as to why that had happened until decades later in 2006, when Barbara was in her 70s, when the government finally came out and admitted the truth. It would turn out Barbara's dance instructor was correct in thinking there had been an explosion on July 16, 1945. But of course, it was not any of the cabin's heaters or anything local to the cabin or the camp. Instead, the explosion occurred 40 miles away at a US government testing site in the middle of the New Mexico desert. And the explosion that literally caused the girls to be dumped out of their beds was from the world's first ever atomic bomb being dropped. It was the Manhattan Project's Trinity test, a test that no civilians in the area had been warned about. And so after this bomb detonated, there was this nuclear fallout that rained from the sky on 500,000 people that lived within a 150-mile radius of the detonation site. And within those 500,000 people were those 10 innocent teenage girls at their dance camp. The snow that the girls played in was actually radioactive material from this nuclear fallout raining down from the sky that over the course of 17 years would give 9 of the girls various forms of cancer that would kill them. Here is the picture that the dance instructor took of Barbara posing in the middle of the river as the snow is falling all around her. As you can see, Barbara is smiling and looking up at the snow, not realizing it's literally going to kill almost everyone in that picture. As for Barbara, she did not die young. However, she would suffer from multiple cancers and illnesses, all associated with radiation exposure. A little after 3 p.m. on March 22, 1959, a 20-year-old British college student named Neil Moss stood in a cavern about 1,000 feet underground in northern England. And as he stood there, he was staring with excitement into this dark hole right in front of him. The cavern that Neil was standing inside of was known as Peak Cavern, and it was one of the biggest and most twisting cave systems in the entire country. In fact, it was so big that at one point, an entire village of 30 rope makers lived inside of this cave. And then also, after those rope makers, the cave system became a hideout for criminals and thieves because there were so many secret passageways and basically places to hide inside of this system. So basically, Peak Cavern was a pretty famous place. And as a result, basically all of it had been mapped out or at least explored by scientists and spelunkers, except for this hole right in front of Neil. It was an entrance to a tunnel that nobody even knew about. Neil and the amateur exploration group that he was a part of had discovered this entryway about 2 weeks earlier. Now, neither Neil nor anybody else in this group had actually gone into this hole yet, and the reason for that was it was pretty dangerous. I mean, the opening to this tunnel was pretty small. It was 1.5 feet by 2 feet wide at the opening, and just looking down into it, I mean, it's a dark hole that you really can't tell how tight or how far it even goes. And so once you went inside of it, the deeper you got, the higher the risk of entrapment. And so whoever actually went into this hole really needed to be prepared. But Neil and the rest of his amateur exploration group really felt like it would be worth it to try to go down this tunnel. Not just because nobody had done it before, but specifically, they thought there was a chance that beyond this tunnel, basically deep underground, if you followed it long enough, it could lead to another big open chamber that nobody had found before. And those types of big open chambers, whoever finds them, gets it named after them. And so Neil and his group were thinking, hey, if we find this big chamber, it'll be named after us. We'll be famous, at least in, spelunking circles. But they also understood that there might be nothing at the other end of this tunnel. It could just be a dead end. But the only way to know for sure would be if one of the members of this group went into the hole. Now, in addition to a fear of being trapped in the hole, there were other big issues with blindly crawling into a tunnel no one's been in before. Like, for example, there could be a sudden drop-off, or running water, or some other hazard that whoever went into the hole wouldn't know about until they were facing it. And so naturally, everybody in this group was excited about the hole, but also a little apprehensive about being the guinea pig to actually go into the hole. And so after the group had kind of stood around the hole for a minute, kind of talking through who was going to do it, Neil had finally courageously volunteered to be the guinea pig. He would go down. And in many ways, Neil was kind of like the perfect candidate for this job. He was smart, he was strong, and most importantly, he was thin, which meant he could navigate a really tight space. The only drawback to Neil was he was pretty tall. He was over 6 feet. And generally speaking, the best cavers in the world are very short and thin because it allows them to get into the smallest, tightest spaces underground. And so Neil, who was standing over the hole, began to mentally prepare himself for what he was about to do. He pulled out his flashlight and he shined it straight down into this hole, which again is a pretty narrow hole, and it basically went straight down. And as he was shining it, he saw about 12 feet down, the hole kind of turned and you couldn't see what was beyond it. And so Neil knew the only part of this trip he would know about is that first 12 feet. Once he made that turn, everything beyond that was totally unknown. Literally no one in the world knew what was beyond it. But Neil was about to find out. The cave explorers anchored this 75-foot-long wire ladder that was all rolled up to this rock that was inside the cavern, right near the opening to this hole. And once that was in place, they spooled out the ladder and kind of dumped it down into the hole. And so it fell 12 feet down and landed right where this tunnel turned and sort of went into oblivion, where nobody knows what happened after that. And so Neil, his job was going to be to go into this hole feet first, go down 12 feet, and then with his feet, as he kind of blindly crawled backwards feet first into the tunnel, he'd be kicking with his feet this ladder, extending it farther and farther into this tunnel. The idea was this ladder was his way back out again. So he's basically on top of the ladder, making his way, and at any point he can just grab the ladder and climb back out again. And so once the ladder was in place and all the cave explorers were kind of waiting for Neil walked up to the edge of the hole, he took a deep breath, and then he swung one leg into the hole, placed it on one of the rungs of the ladder, put his other leg on the ladder as well, and kind of tested it to make sure the rock that was anchoring the ladder could hold his weight. Once he was sure it could, he said goodbye to the explorers and then began his descent, feet first, down into the hole. As Neil slowly and carefully climbed down this ladder during this first 12-foot section, he felt the walls of this hole closing in on him. When he was close to the bottom of this first section, the walls were literally flush with his shoulders and back. I mean, this was a really tight space. And so finally he got to the very bottom of this 12-foot section, and he was about to step onto what he thought was another rung, because he can't actually see where he's going. He's just using his feet to feel. And he stepped down and he felt something hard. It was the ground. So he had reached the bottom of the 12-foot section. He kind of tested the ground with his foot, seeing if it would support his weight. And after feeling confident, he stepped off the ladder and just stood at the bottom of the hole. At this point, Neil used his feet to kick the ladder that was still coiled up at the bottom of the hole into the next turn, into the next section of the tunnel that he'd be going down. And as soon as he kicked it, he heard it kind of spool out as it tumbled down this next section. However, it was not a straight drop like this first section was. This next section he'd be going into was more of a gradual decline, just based on the sound this ladder was making as it tumbled down. And so after the ladder had stopped making noise and he knew it had stopped, Neil gave one final look up at his friends above, gave them a little wave, even though he could barely move his hands because it's so tight around him. And then he got down on his stomach and feet first began shimmying himself down into this next section. Now, during the first 12 feet and during the initial turn into this new section, Neil had been able to turn his head and basically look down and see where his feet were going. But after only a few feet of going into this new section, the walls had become so tight on his body that he couldn't even move his head. He really was blind and had no idea where he was going. Now, for a lot of people, this would have been a claustrophobic nightmare. Neil is in this unbelievably tight space. He has no idea what's gonna happen next. He doesn't know if it's gonna get so tight he'll get wedged in there. It's cold, it's damp. I mean, it's pitch black in there. He does have a headlamp, but his head is like kind of pressed to the ground and he can't really move it. So, he's not really able to look around him. And periodically, as he was shimmying his way down deeper into this tunnel, he would dislodge rocks from the wall and he would hear them strike the wall as they tumbled down into oblivion. He had no idea if these rocks were tumbling into a dead end or if they were tumbling off a ledge somewhere, a ledge that he wouldn't be aware of until he got to it. But for Neil, this environment was something he thrived in. It was why he was so drawn to cave exploration. As much as cave exploring was a physical exercise and a physical test, it was much more a mental test. I mean, can you handle being in these tight spaces and persevering and continuing on when you're all by yourself and it's like dangers all around you? And also, Neil just loved being alone and in the dark. So cave exploration was like perfect for him. When Neil had made it about 10 feet down this new section, his feet touched the rolled up section of the ladder. And so with his toes, he kind of gave it a kick and the ladder tumbled for a second and he could hear it. And then it just kind of vanished altogether, like the ladder had gone over a cliff. And so Neil realized, very likely, just beyond his feet, even though he cannot see it, is a ledge, and very likely either a drop-off or a new cavern. The thing they hope is on the other end of this tunnel. And so this was exciting for Neil. He felt a rush of adrenaline. There's a new turn in the tunnel, and for all he knows, this is the cavern they're looking for. Or it's just another section of tunnel he would have to explore. But either way, he's making progress. And so Neil very carefully scooched backwards until he felt the edge, at which point he let his legs go over the edge, he found his footing on the ladder, and it was at this point when he kind of turned around a little bit that he could see this was not some big open cavern he had found, it was just a turn in the tunnel system. It was now going back to basically a vertical hole, big enough to fit inside of, but Neil has no idea how deep it goes or what it leads to. But Neil was totally undeterred, He lowered his whole body into the section, got on the ladder, and began descending. And very quickly, as he began this descent, the walls of this section, this new vertical section, were so tight, it was about 18 inches in diameter, that he actually couldn't just go straight down. His body didn't fit just trying to maneuver down. So the only way he could get himself to go down further was to shimmy himself side to side like a corkscrew, basically forcing his body deeper and deeper into this hole. And so Neil continued doing this for an additional 18 feet down in this new section of tunnel, which put him at a total of 40 feet down into this tunnel from the entrance where the rest of his friends were. And when he got down there, 18 feet down, he went to step onto the rung to continue his descent, but his foot hit rock. And he felt around with his feet, and he realized this tunnel did not lead to a big new chamber. It instead was a dead end after all. Now, just to be sure, Neil actually kicked as hard as he could. He's kind of restricted, but he kicked with his legs as much as he could to see if maybe this wasn't a true dead end. Maybe it was just an obstruction and he could clear it. But he could tell, after a few stomps, this was not moving. This really was the end. Now, part of Neil was disappointed because he was hoping that by doing this, they would discover this big new chamber and they'd get it named after them. But on the other hand, he was also relieved because by this point, it was extremely claustrophobic, even for a guy who thrived in this environment. By the bottom of this 40-foot section, he is completely wedged in place. And so Neil decided it was time to head back to the surface. But from where he was at, he couldn't even hear his friends. He's way down deep in this tunnel. It's totally pitch black. And so what he needed to do was just begin climbing back up this ladder. And then, about halfway up, he could call up to his friends and tell them, hey, I'm returning. But remember, to get to where Neil is, he has literally forced his body down into this tiny hole, basically corkscrewing himself as deep as he could get. And so he's totally restricted, and his arms are basically by his side, and his hands are basically pinned in front of his body. And so Neil tried to grab the ladder, which is literally pressed up against his chest, to begin the ascent. But even though his fingers could touch the rungs of the ladder, he couldn't actually move his arms to pull himself up the ladder. He could just hold the rung. That was it. But Neil had been in similar situations before, and what you do is you just use your legs. You drive with your legs and push your body up until your arms can go above your head, and then you continue the ascent. However, his legs also were basically in the same situation. It was so unbelievably tight around his legs that he couldn't lift his legs up. He could just basically wiggle his feet. Basically, there was no way physically for Neil to get himself out. He would need his team up above to pull him out. And so Neil began shouting as loud as he could, trying to get the attention of his friends up above, telling them, hey, I'm stuck, pull me out. And then also, as best as he could with his hands on the rung, he kind of pulled on the ladder, signaling to them like, hey, get me out of here. Now, he couldn't really hear anything up above. It was sort of muffled and, he couldn't tell if they were yelling back down to him. But as he was holding onto the ladder, he felt a little bit of tension, suggesting they were pulling on him. However, as he held on, waiting to be pulled up and out, he didn't budge. Despite the tension on this ladder clearly coming from the surface from his friends, he wasn't moving. And that's when Neil realized he had made a critical mistake. When he had reached the bottom of this tunnel, when he realized it was a dead end, he had stomped with his feet to confirm it really was a dead end. And when he had done that, he had inadvertently kicked the rungs of this ladder into a crevice, and then rocks, which he had heard kind of falling when he was kicking, landed on top of it, basically pinning the ladder in place. Basically, this ladder was now anchored inside the cave, which meant no matter how hard his friends on the surface pulled, they would not be able to pull the ladder up, which meant they couldn't pull Neil up. And Neil, once he realized this was the issue, he tried to move his feet to clear the rocks off the bottom of the ladder, but he couldn't. It was too tight around him. And so Neil was totally stuck. The members of Neil's exploration group pretty much immediately realized this was a crisis, because not only was Neil stuck in this cave, but in these tight little tunnels underground, there's limited oxygen. So it's not just a matter of, we'll figure it out and get Neil out somehow. It's like, no, you have a limited amount of time before Neil runs out of oxygen down there. Even if you come up with a solution, it might be too late. And so immediately, members of the exploration group left Peak Cavern to go get help. And before long, over 200 people had flooded the cavern, including a mountain rescue unit and a coal mining extraction team and a whole bunch of civilians who were all there to try to figure out how to get Neil out. Now, at first, Neil was very optimistic about his recovery. He could hear clearly all the commotion 40 feet above him. He couldn't fully discern what was going on there, but he could clearly tell a major rescue operation was afoot. And so as ropes were cast down and ladders were cast down to try to get him out, and they continued to fail, and as the air he was breathing began to thin out and it was getting harder to breathe, Neil's reaction was to kind of be positive. He actually began cracking jokes and calling up like, hey, how much longer do I have to wait down here? But as the minutes turned into hours and none of the efforts by any of the rescuers were working, Neil began to panic. His heart was racing, not only from his nerves, but also because he was running out of oxygen. He had begun to grit his teeth really hard to kind of control his fear, but he was really starting to lose it. At one point, the rescuers threw down an oxygen mask for him to breathe because it was clear the air was becoming a real issue. But even though the mask literally tumbled down and hit him right on the head, so it's right here, he couldn't get his arms up to put the mask on. And so there it is, salvation, but he couldn't use it. And so before long, Neil sort of began drifting in and out of consciousness. One moment he'd be calling up to his rescuers, asking for an update. The next, they'd call down to him and get no response. Clearly, this situation was becoming dire. Now, to this point, the way the rescue had gone was the rescuers were basically throwing equipment into the hole, be it ladders or ropes or oxygen masks for Neil to grab onto or put on him, and they were hoping that basically Neil could get himself out of the hole. Because the great fear was, if we send a rescuer, or rescuers plural, into this hole to get him, they could get stuck, and now we have an even bigger problem. But when Neil began losing consciousness, when they couldn't get him to call back to them, they knew they were genuinely running out of time. And so they began pumping oxygen into the hole to hopefully buy some extra time. And then they decided, we gotta send someone into the hole. Someone has to go in there, get Neil, and pull him out. And so one by one, these courageous rescuers went down into the hole, and 8 times they tried, and 8 times they failed. All 8 either got stuck along the way or they passed out along the way. 3 people actually reached Neil and actually touched Neil, but there was no way to grab him and pull him out. And so Neil, who was conscious for a lot of this, he's hearing and literally in some cases seeing rescue. It's right there, it's right in front of him, but it just didn't work. By the time the 8th man was pulled back out of the hole, they could hear in the hole this horrible sound, which was Neil gasping for air. Even though they were attempting to pump air into this hole, it wasn't enough, and Neil just couldn't fill his lungs with enough oxygen. And so the rescuers yelled into the hole for Neil to just hold on. They were gonna get him out of there, just be strong, hold on. But by this point, Neil, he wasn't even saying anything back. He just continued making these awful gasping sounds. By about 7 p.m., when Neil had been stuck in this hole for 4 hours, the rescuers decided to send one more guy into this hole, this really small civilian. And he went down there with a rope to attach around Neil and hopefully pull him out. And this little civilian managed to get all the way down, all the way to Neil. And when he found Neil, Neil was unconscious, but alive. And the rescuer put the rope around Neil's shoulders and then signaled to the surface to begin pulling. And so from the surface, they pulled on this rope, and slowly but surely, Neil began to be pulled out of the hole. And he moved about 18 inches, being monitored by the civilian who was down there. However, because they were pulling so hard on this rope to get Neil to move, the pressure from that rope was basically crushing Neil's chest, and he stopped breathing. And the civilian who was down there with Neil noticed it and yelled up to the group to stop. And they had to take the rope off because, yeah, they might be able to pull him out this way, but they would kill him. He would suffocate. And so once the civilian rescuer came out of the hole, he told the group, look, Neil's body is simply too big to be yanked out of the hole safely. He needs to be conscious and able to contort and twist his body, basically undoing what Neil did to get down there, in order to get out again. We need his participation, and he's unconscious, so we can't do that. And so at this point, the rescuers were totally desperate. They know Neil is still alive. They can hear some of his ragged breathing coming out of the hole, but they knew they had to do something drastic right now or Neil was gonna die. And so they came up with this plan for this even smaller rescuer, this woman, to go down into the hole, get to Neil, and break his collarbone to try to shrink his body to be able to pull him out. And so this woman, she goes down there and she reaches Neil, but she failed to break his collarbone. And so she too had to come out of the hole, leaving Neil behind. And so once the woman came out of the hole, it became clear to the rescuers that Neil was not getting out of this hole, even though he was just 40 feet away and at this moment still very much alive. They could hear his ragged breathing, but there was just nothing anybody could do. And so one of the rescuers called Neil's father and told him, "You need to come out to Peak Cavern." Not long after that, Neil's father, Eric Moss, arrived at Peak Cavern. Now, he knew going into this that his son was stuck. That's why he got the phone call to come out here. But he did not understand just how dire the situation really was. But as soon as he got to Peak Cavern and saw all these vehicles outside and the hundreds of rescuers coming in and out of the cave with these sad, dark expressions on their faces, Eric knew this was really bad. And so Eric made his way into Peak Cavern, and for hours he just hoped and prayed that whatever was happening would be enough to get his son out. And for hours, Eric just stood there in Peak Cavern, hoping to see his son emerge from the hole, hoping to come up and say everything is okay, but he didn't. And things only got worse. It eventually began to rain, and unfortunately, Peak Cavern, and specifically the hole that Neil was stuck inside of, flood when it rains. And so as rainwater is pouring into this cavern and Neil is still alive but stuck in this hole, they had to make the heart-wrenching decision in front of Neil's father to abandon the operation and get out of the cave, knowing Neil was going to die. Rescuers were finally able to get back into Peak Cavern at about 3 a.m. on March 24th, which is approximately 36 hours after Neil got trapped. By this point, the rains had subsided, the flood had cleared, and so they went in there hoping for a miracle. And when they got to the hole and listened into it, they actually heard Neil still breathing. He was still alive, but it was very clear he was at the end of his life. And all they could do was just sit around this hole and listen as Neil took his last few final ragged breaths. And then eventually they listened as Neil took his final breath and the hole went silent. Now, at this point, it was too dangerous to send anybody back down into this hole, and so no one could get physically close enough to Neil to actually confirm that he really is dead. However, after the hole remained silent for quite a while, a doctor who was on site did walk over and declare Neil dead. And so at this point, the rescue operation became a recovery operation. However, as rescuers were getting ready to go back down into the hole to retrieve Neil's body, it was at this point that Neil's father, Eric Moss, who had been there this whole time and had been witness to the doctor declaring his son dead, it was at this point that he stepped in and said, "Stop, get everybody out of the cave. I don't want anybody else to lose their lives." And so ultimately, Eric made the decision to leave his son's body where it was. Eventually, once it was 100% certain that Neil really must be dead at this point, they would fill in the hole that Neil had climbed down inside of with loose rocks from the cave, entombing him inside of it forever. And in his memory, the tunnel that Neil died inside of was named after him. It's called Moss Chamber. On the morning of October 21st, 1990, a 30-year-old man named Lee Hunsho and 3 of his friends hiked up Bilu Mountain, which is located in northern Taiwan. Now, by this point, the group had already been hiking for several hours, and so they were quite tired. I mean, Lee's legs absolutely burned, but Lee and the others kept on pushing until they reached the top of this rocky ridge. They all stopped and were able to catch their breath for a minute. So Lee was a bank manager, but he was also a very outdoorsy person, and he'd been wanting to do this hike up Bilu Mountain for a long time because it was sort of like a rite of passage for hikers in Taiwan. It took an average of almost 8 hours to get to the top and back down again, and the terrain could be really rough. As a result, it was considered one of the most challenging hikes in all of Taiwan. But despite that, it was also a major tourist destination that was usually really busy, with lots of people attempting to do this hike. But on this particular day, for whatever reason, the friends had not seen anybody else on this trail. No one. And I mean, the weather was good, it was a weekend. I mean, there was really no good reason for nobody to be here, but they had the mountain to themselves. So Lee and his friends, they stood on this rocky ridge and caught their breath. They had some water, they had a couple of snacks, and then it was onward because they were not at the summit yet. I mean, this was a beautiful lookout point they were at, but they still had some pretty difficult climbing ahead. And so on they went, very excitedly. They're making their way towards the top. This is something they were all really excited about. And eventually they reached this section of the mountain that was sort of famous amongst tourists. because it was a really, really steep section where the only way to get up was actually to climb a rope. There was a rope anchored into the mountain where, hikers had to grab the rope and walk and pull themselves up this section. It was like this kind of cool part that made you feel really rugged. And so when the men got to the spot, they all wanted to make sure there was a picture of them navigating this particular terrain. And so one by one, each of the men got on the rope and sort of paused at some point and turned around and made sure to get a cool picture of themselves making this really difficult section of the climb. And then once they had all taken their picture, they actually went the rest of the way up the rope and continued all the way up to the summit. And once they were on the summit, the friends actually didn't spend a whole lot of time there. I mean, remember, it takes almost 8 hours to do this entire round trip. And so you're sort of fighting against the darkness. You want to get back down before the sun goes down. And so they were up there long enough to get a couple of pictures and, again, to take stock of the fact that basically no one is here. In fact, literally, nobody is here but them. It just seems sort of surreal. This is such a beautiful place, such a popular place. Why is nobody here? But didn't matter. They got their pictures, they got their beautiful scenery, they had some more water and snacks, and then they began making their descent. Now, on the way up, the friends had all been together. There was no separation. They were all, one by one, navigating each part of the terrain and making their way up together. But on the return trip, they got pretty separated. In part because Lee was really dragging behind. He was just so tired from the ascent that he sort of told the others, like, hey, go ahead, like you can walk ahead of me. We all know where we're going. We're going down and we'll meet at the car, so just go on ahead. And so Lee's friends had done just that. They had sort of taken off and gotten a bit of a lead on Lee. And so after a couple of hours of the group sort of broken up, making their way down the mountain, the friends in the front, who had left Lee behind effectively, they stopped at a certain point and they realized like they were really huffing it down the mountain, moving really quickly. And they thought, you know what? Lee was really tired up there. Maybe we ought to just sit here and wait for a minute and let him catch up, and then we'll make the final stretch together. And so the friends, they stop. And again, they're sort of looking around thinking how weird it is that nobody else is here but them. Like still, no one's come up the mountain. No one's come down the mountain. It's just them. It's very odd. They're sitting there waiting and they're looking back up the trail, expecting Lee to show up anytime, but he doesn't. And so eventually one of the friends says, you know what, you guys stay here. I'm gonna go back up the mountain a little ways and just see if I can catch Lee and just walk with him back down. I'm sure he's just exhausted and, I'll help him sort of finish up the hike here. And so this one friend, he begins going back up the trail. And for quite a while, he's basically hiking back up the mountain. And the whole time he's expecting he's gonna run into Lee. He has to. I mean, there were other trails that spidered off on the way down. So it was possible to take a wrong turn and sort of accidentally go down the wrong path. But for the most part, it was pretty linear. But as he's going up, he has not found Lee. And after a while, he's been hiking for like an hour back up the mountain and still no Lee. And he thinks, you know what, I can't do this. It's getting dark out. I have to go back and catch up with the other friends and just go down to the car, because at this point, it seems pretty likely that Lee must have gotten turned around and he must have taken one of those other pathways. And now he's probably ahead of me. He's probably down at the car by this point. And so this friend who had done the rescue mission turned around, went back down, linked up with the other friends that were still sitting there waiting for him. Together, they walked all the way down the trail and they got to the car. And when they got there, they're expecting to see Lee, but he wasn't there. And by now, the sun had basically set. And so the friends realized that, okay, like we have a real problem here. I mean, clearly Lee didn't just get lost. He's still on the mountain somewhere. And like, what are we gonna do? It's about to be nighttime. Like, we can't go up there looking for him. And so they hopped in their car and they drove to the nearest police station to tell them to go look for Lee. And sure enough, there would be this huge search that was launched for Lee. And over the coming week, I mean, there were all these people out scouring the mountain looking for Lee, but they couldn't find him. And after a week of searching, the police had to call it off. And so Lee's friends and family were left with this huge question mark. Like, where did he go? What happened to him? I mean, the not knowing was in some ways worse than having found out he had died or something. And so there's this horrible uncertainty. Nobody really knows how to react to this. Do you grieve his loss now, or do you hold out hope that maybe he's still alive? Well, the friends and family kind of did the latter. They kind of held out hope that, maybe he's out there somewhere. And weeks turned into months, and eventually 4 months went by. And it was at that point that other hikers who were making their way up the mountain, they went off the trail on purpose. They were sort of off the trail for a bit. and they came across Lee's body. Now, the immediate reaction was obviously devastation for Lee's family and friends. But at least it seemed like they were going to get closure about what actually happened to Lee. However, when police began to investigate what actually killed Lee and why, they ran into a lot of anomalies. Number one, they did an autopsy and they couldn't figure out what killed him. There was no clear cause of death. Number two, where he was found, he was just kind of sitting there, with his back against the mountain. His pack was right next to him. It almost seemed like he just sat down and then just died in place. But again, there's no clear cause of death. There was no obvious, trauma he sustained. It certainly didn't seem like he fell. He didn't appear to have any obvious injuries. He just stopped at some point on the mountain and died. And on top of that, remember, Lee is like a seasoned climber. He had supplies in his bag that could at least last him for some time. He had a flashlight, he had a compass. He knew where he needed to go, down the mountain to the car. Why is he stopping? Again, no injuries, no clear injuries. Why is he stopping right there until he dies? It just didn't add up. But then there was another very strange development that sort of took the story in a totally new direction. One of the friends who was with Lee on that doomed hike, the one who had the camera that took pictures of all of them climbing up that rope and took pictures up on the summit, he went and got his pictures developed shortly after Lee had been found dead. And when he went through the photos from their trip, he could not believe what he found. Here is the photo of Lee posing with that rope. And if you notice, at the top of this segment, there's a person clearly up there looking down at Lee and his friends. But remember, they didn't see anybody else on the mountain the entire time they were there. And they certainly did not see that appears to be a young girl in a red jacket, right at the top of the segment they were in when they were taking those photos. They didn't see her. They would have absolutely communicated with her, but they didn't see her. And so they have this photo of this girl in Lee's picture, but she wasn't in any of the other photos. She was just in Lee's. And making this even stranger is there was this myth about this mountain, that there were these spirits on this mountain that would sometimes target hikers and lead them astray away from their friends off the trail, where effectively they would die. And wouldn't you know it, it seemed an awful lot like Lee was led astray and just sort of sat down and died on the mountain shortly after that picture captured this girl in red looking down at him. On the morning of August 8th, 2024, a 48-year-old Russian woman named Lyudmila Lazarenko sat on the floor of a bungalow deep in the Amazon rainforest in Peru. The bungalow was small and mostly just for sleeping, but it was connected to a communal kitchen and dining space. Lyudmila sat right in the middle of the bungalow on the floor, with her eyes closed and her legs crossed, and she was trying to meditate, but the sounds of the birds and the insects outside in the rainforest, plus the sound of her friend, Ivan Kuzmin, who was moving around in the attached kitchen, were making it hard for her to concentrate. And so Lyudmila finally gave up on meditating for right now, and she opened her eyes and she looked out towards the kitchen, and she saw her friend, Ivan, who was 38 years old and from Ukraine, and he was busy brewing some tea. So Lyudmila and Ivan genuinely were just platonic friends. In fact, Lyudmila, she was married and had 2 kids, but she was out here alone. She and Ivan were actually part of what was a retreat out in the Amazonian rainforest with other people from all over the world who would come out here to meditate in nature and do some soul searching and hopefully come back to their regular lives with some additional perspective. Now, Lyudmila and Ivan had been going to retreats like this for the better part of 2 years, and that was actually how the two had met each other. And so they were just friends. They had this similar interest in going to retreats like this one. But there was one aspect of these retreats that really is the thing that drew Lyudmila and Ivan out to the rainforest. It was not just to sit in nature and just hope for the best. They would go to these ayahuasca retreats, where basically they were led through this meditative process where they would drink this very special tea that would sort of affect you in different ways. And, some people believed it sort of led you on this spiritual journey where, it's just this very powerful, soul-searching event where you come out of this thing feeling like a different person. If you've had trauma in your life, or you have, post-traumatic stress, or maybe you have trauma in your life that you're not even aware of, going through this style of retreat, these ayahuasca retreats, people have said has been very powerful and transformative. And Ludmila, she lived a pretty typical life back home. She's a very busy mom and a wife, and she found doing these retreats really offered her a big reset. She felt like it was the one chance for her to kind of disconnect from responsibility and just be at peace. And Ivan, for the most part, felt very much the same way. I mean, he came to these retreats for similar reasons for his own life. And so here they are, they're out in the rainforest, and they're brewing up some tea, some ayahuasca tea, and they're in this bungalow and they're getting ready to have this sort of meditative journey, but they were about to break a very important rule. So the man who ran this particular retreat out in this part of the rainforest, he made it explicitly clear to everybody who came out there that no matter how many times you've come to these retreats or similar retreats, you never, ever drink the ayahuasca without a shaman present, basically without somebody else there to sort of help guide you through this process. If you were to do it on your own, who knows what could happen? And so everybody knew you cannot do this on your own. But Ludmila and Ivan, they felt like, what, I get it. We're not supposed to do that, we know that. But we've done this so many times and we know what we're doing. So let's just brew up some ayahuasca of our own and we'll stay in our bungalow and we'll drink it ourselves. We'll have our own experience. Nobody will even know. And so that's what Ivan was doing in the kitchen. He was making ayahuasca tea. And when he was done, he grabbed 2 mugs of this tea. He walked back over to Ludmila, who was in the bungalow section. He sat down next to her. They drank their tea and they both laid down on the ground and closed their eyes. A couple of hours later, the director of this retreat, who at the time was directing some group meditation not very far away from the bungalow where Ivan and Ludmila were, he was doing this group meditation when he heard a loud scream, and it was coming from somewhere near the bungalows. And instinctively, he got up, he abandoned the group he was with, and he ran to the scream. And he saw one of his staff members. She was the one who screamed, and she was standing looking into the bungalow where Ivan and Ludmila were. And so the director rushes over and gets right next to this woman, and he looks into the bungalow. And immediately, he knew 2 things. One, he knew for a fact these 2, Ivan and Ludmila, had broken the rule. They had taken ayahuasca without a shaman present. And 2, they had paid a horrible, horrible price. So ayahuasca is not just some herbal tea. It is a very powerful hallucinogen. And that's the whole point. People go out into the rainforest for these retreats and drink this hallucinogen in order to basically have perspective on their lives that you can only get by, introducing this chemical and causing yourself to hallucinate. People talk about almost seeing themselves from the outside looking in and like having this deeply spiritual event where you come out of your trip, that's what it's called, feeling like, oh my goodness, I know myself better now because of the hallucinations I just went through. But critically, the reason you have to have a shaman present in these retreats is really for safety. Because sometimes when you take ayahuasca, you have a bad trip where you have all these hallucinations, but they're of horrible, terrifying things, but you can't differentiate them from reality. And so you're living in a nightmare. And a lot of times these bad trips, it feels like something's gonna happen to you. You're gonna get hurt in some way, or somebody else is gonna get hurt unless you act. But again, you're sort of out of your mind. And so you have these shamans present to protect you from yourself. But Ivan and Ludmila didn't have a shaman present. And so when they entered their trip, Ludmila was having a good trip, Ivan was not. He had a horrible trip. And in his trip, he believed that Ludmila had become possessed by evil spirits, and he needed to save her soul. And how was he gonna save her? Well, he took a metal bottle and beat her savagely, and then he went and got a knife from the communal kitchen and he proceeded to dismember her. That staff member who walked over and screamed, they looked in and saw Ivan looking at them, smiling, totally insane looking, still high on ayahuasca, and there are pieces of Ludmila all over the bungalow. Here is a picture that was taken of Ivan very shortly after that staff member discovered this bloodbath inside of the bungalow. Ivan is literally sitting on the ground, feet away from pieces of Ludmila. He's just murdered her savagely, and he's still absolutely tripping on ayahuasca. He looks like an absolute madman. Ivan would come down from his ayahuasca trip, And when he did, he immediately confessed to what he had done. And he was arrested for murder, and he is currently serving time in prison in Peru. Around 4 p.m. on August 20th, 1975, an 18-year-old boy named Michael McQuilkin hiked up a massive granite rock called Morro Rock, which is in Sequoia National Park in California. Michael's 12-year-old brother Sean and his 15-year-old sister Mary were also on this hike with him, but currently they were lagging way behind, and he could just tell it was because they were tired. Now, the hike to the summit of Morro Rock was only a quarter of a mile, like this is a pretty short hike, but it was really steep. And Michael, despite only being 18, was sort of a pretty seasoned climber. I mean, he had just hiked 200 miles through the Sierra Nevada mountain range all by himself. And so for him, this terrain was no big deal, but he knows his siblings are not big mountaineers, nor are they pretending to be. And so he thought, okay, I'll wait, I'll let them catch up. But as Michael waited, he started to notice that the sky was getting pretty dark. Now, he had checked the weather before coming out here, and there was not supposed to be a storm, but it was sort of undeniable that something's happening. This is not normal. It's getting pretty dark and windy. But Michael told himself that, you know what, maybe there's just a little pocket of weather and it'll pass. This can't be a big deal. And then eventually his siblings finally caught up to him, and then together, just a couple of minutes later, they were right at the summit. Now, by the time they were on the summit, they're looking out and the view is spectacular. But now it's becoming increasingly apparent to all three of them that this weather system, whatever's rolling in here, is pretty big and pretty bad. This is not some passing little thing. The sky is like pitch black at this point. But before they left, they just wanted to take a quick picture. And so because they didn't have a tripod or anything, they actually had Mary just take a picture of Michael and Sean. It was the best they were gonna do. They couldn't really get a group shot. And so Mary snaps a photo of the two brothers. And then after taking this photo, they put the camera away and they're about to begin their descent when suddenly, all around them, everything turns bright white, and there's this loud cracking sound, and then Michael is thrown to the ground, and before he has any idea what's going on, he's looking over, and he sees his brothers on the ground, his sisters on the ground, and in fact, he sees smoke coming off of Sean's back. And that's when he realized they had just been struck by lightning. Now, Michael didn't really know if he was badly hurt or not, but he was able to jump right to his feet, and he felt like he was basically okay. And his sister also, she was able to stand up, and they're obviously both disoriented and shocked. But Sean, I mean, he's in a heap on the ground and is literally smoking. It seemed like he really took the brunt of this lightning strike. And so Michael and his sister, they scooped Sean up, and together they hustled down the mountain, they got in a car, and they rushed to the hospital. And somewhat unbelievably, despite taking effectively a near direct hit from a lightning bolt, Sean survived. I mean, he was covered in burns, but he and Michael and Mary all lived through this strike. But the reason we know about this lightning strike is not just because they survived. That's great, but that's not why we still talk about it today. The reason we still talk about it today is because of that picture that Mary took of Michael and Sean standing on the summit of this mountain. If you look at this picture, you can see that the two brothers, their hair is sticking up in all directions. And they noticed at the time that their hair was standing up, but they didn't know why. They thought it was kind of funny. That's why they're smiling in the picture. But what they didn't realize they were capturing in this photo is the very scary phenomenon that occurs when you're basically right about to be struck by lightning. The air around you, especially if you're in a very exposed spot, like the summit of a mountain, gets electrically charged, and your hair stands up right before you're hit by the bolt. And so now, this picture is now used by the National Park Service to show people what to be aware of when you're out hiking on these mountains. If your hair starts to stand up, you better move. On 4:45 p.m. on February 11th, 1995, a 50-year-old man named Eric Tollett sat in his office in the furniture factory that he owned in Northumberland, which is a pretty rural country in northern England. From inside his office, all Eric could hear outside was the thumping of the rain on the roof. There was this low-pressure system in the area which was causing a really intense thunderstorm. In fact, the storm was so bad that Eric had actually decided to close the factory for the day so all his employees could stay home during the storm. And Eric was glad that he could actually afford to give his employees a day off like this, because it had not always been that way. He had bought this factory 16 years earlier, and it had taken all of his savings and scrapping together all of his money to actually make the investment. And then after he purchased the factory, it required a huge renovation to make it ready to be a furniture factory that he could actually sell products out of. But now, after 16 years of hard work, his business was quite successful. And so a day like today was no big deal. He wasn't all that concerned about the lost profits that day. Instead, he was just using the time to catch up on some admin work and also spend some time with his family. Eric's girlfriend, whose name was Leslie, was at the factory with him, hanging out in the office as well. And also Eric's brother, whose name was Donald, had taken Leslie's 8-year-old son over to the factory's attached garage to go play. But as Eric, shuffled through his paperwork and did a few things, and Leslie was over at the window looking outside, suddenly the door to his office swung open. And it was Leslie's 8-year-old son who came barging in. There's no Donald, so Eric's brother's not with him. And the son, he just looked totally panicked. And he immediately said, before, Eric or Leslie could ask any questions, that Donald had collapsed over in the attached garage. Now, initially, Eric didn't really know what to make of this, but his first thought was, his brother Donald was 60 and he did have some health issues. And just hearing this kid say that Donald had collapsed, it signaled to Eric, like, oh my goodness, did Donald have a heart attack? Or he was also thinking, this kid's only 8 years old. Is he overreacting? Is there actually something totally benign happening? Whatever it was, Eric knew immediately that it was time to drop everything and run over there and check on Donald. And so that's what he did. He and Leslie put their stuff down. They ran with the 8-year-old, through all the way to this attached garage, which, in virtue of it being attached, they never actually went outside into the storm. They just ran straight to this garage. And sure enough, when they got there was Donald laying on the ground. And so before Eric ran over to his brother to assess him, to see what was going on, he just stopped right in the doorway and turned to Leslie and her son, and he told them, go back to my office and call 911. I'll be in there as soon as I can. And so they turned, they left, and then Eric, he turned back around, rushed into the garage, and knelt down next to Donald. And right away, he could tell that his brother was not breathing, and as he's sort of feeling around for some sign of life, suddenly Eric began to feel this incredible tightness in his chest. And then before he knew it, he had blacked out and collapsed right next to his brother. So before Eric purchased this factory 16 years earlier, it had been a factory, but it was not a furniture factory. It was a coal factory. And in virtue of that, there was a coal mine that literally was attached to the structure. Basically, the coal would come up out of the mine and be processed inside of this, big warehouse. Now, when Eric bought it, he knew that there was this coal mine and there was this entrance to the coal mine connected to the structure. But the coal mine was not in use. The entrance to the coal mine had been completely boarded up and it really played no role whatsoever. However, over the decade and a half that he owned this property and didn't think at all about that coal mine, well, over that time, this poisonous gas called choke damp began to develop inside the mine. And then on the day that, Eric and Donald collapsed inside the garage, well, it was because the low pressure storm outside caused those poisonous gases to rise up and seep out of the boarded up entrance. And those poisonous choke damp gases built up inside of that attached garage, basically making that entire room lethal to anybody inside of there. And so unfortunately, Donald would die from poisoning. Eric, when he passed out, he nearly died, but he was pulled out in time and ultimately woke up in the hospital and he would survive. At 10 a.m. on September 10th, 2022, a 68-year-old woman named Diana Stewart stood on the deck of a small boat in the Pacific Ocean, less than a mile off the eastern coast of New Zealand. She looked out at the perfectly calm, light blue water, and she saw this albatross bird flying across the sky, so she lifted up her camera and took a picture. Diana was a wildlife photographer, and she was also a member of the Nature Photography Society of New Zealand. And she, along with 9 other members of this society, had chartered this boat for a special birdwatching and photography trip. And so far, the trip had lived up to the hype. They'd spent 2 hours sailing around the water, photographing all these beautiful and rare birds and other wildlife. And and they'd even been lucky enough to see a couple of whales. And so this had been really a fantastic trip. Now, at this point, the group had basically finished up their trip, and they were making their way back towards shore. And so as they were going, Diana was keeping her eye out for any last-minute picture opportunities. And as she was looking around, looking for birds, she noticed something in the water. There was something huge moving sort of near the boat. It actually looked like it was moving towards the boat, sort of at an angle. And at first, she couldn't really tell what it was. But then suddenly it came into focus that it was an enormous whale. This huge whale is gonna swim basically right under the boat. And so Diana, she pulled out her camera to take a photo, but then the worst thing possible happened. This whale, sure enough, came towards the boat, but it didn't go under the boat. It rammed the side of the boat. And before Diana could do anything, suddenly the boat was lurching onto its side, and she and the rest of the crew were thrown off the boat into the frigid water. And the second she hit the freezing cold water, her life jacket, which she was wearing, it automatically inflated. It was one of those auto-inflate life jackets. It inflates, and she's sort of disoriented. The water was so shockingly cold. I mean, this is a completely unbelievable situation to find yourself in. But, as she surfaced and she tried to get her bearings, she realized it was pitch black everywhere she looked, and it was so loud. She could barely hear anything but the sound of the engine of the boat. And that's when she realized, as she's putting her hands up, that the boat must have capsized and landed on top of her. But there's this little bit of air. She's basically in an air pocket. But she can't hear anything. She just hears the sound of this engine, and it's deafening. And so she began calling out for help, and she tried to kind of maneuver out from underneath, this curved underside of the boat that created this pocket. But she couldn't find her way out. And this life jacket she had on was fully inflated. She couldn't, deflate it. And because of her buoyancy, she couldn't swim down below and get out from under this boat. And so she's sort of trapped underneath this boat. It's freezing cold. The water could easily give you hypothermia in less than 30 minutes. It's total chaos. It's loud because of the engine. And so Diana's trying not to panic. And as she's sort of looking around, fumbling in the dark, gasping for air, she realized there were other people also trapped underneath. And so she's grabbing at them and trying to talk to them, and they're all panicked. She has no idea, what their state is. Are they hurt? She doesn't know. And so basically her only option at this point was just to bang on the underside of this boat, just trying to get anybody's attention outside, out from underneath where they were, to know that they were trapped under here. They needed help. And in fact, when she began knocking, there were people outside the boat, basically, who had been thrown off the boat. Everybody had been thrown off the boat. There was 11 people. 6 people were not trapped under the boat. 5, including Diana, were trapped underneath. And so as Diana is pounding the underside of the boat, the skipper of the boat, a guy named Mark, he was one of the 6 who were outside, and he clearly heard the knocking sound. And so he's obviously in a bad situation too, same as everybody else in the water. But he was in a markedly better situation because he's not trapped under this boat. And so he quickly understood that, okay, he needs to gather the 6 people he's with, kind of make sure they're okay, and then figure out how they're gonna get these people trapped under the boat out. And so his first instinct was just to bang back on the side of the boat, to let them know, hey, we hear you. But again, you gotta picture the scene. They are suddenly in the water because a whale flipped their boat. They have no idea if this boat's gonna sink any second here. The engine is currently running, so it's super loud. The water is freezing cold. They're out in the middle of the ocean. Like, this is a true life or death situation here. But Mark, he does his best to stay calm. He's hitting the boat back to let the folks know down underneath the boat that they're okay, we'll get you out of there. But underneath, Diana and the others, they're starting to panic. It's hard to breathe down there. I mean, there's really not much air. The water's choppy because they're moving around. And so they're gulping down water as they're doing their best to survive down there. But they just keep hitting the boat back, saying, come on, you gotta get us out of here. But periodically, they'd still try to force themselves out from underneath. But again, their life jacket just made it impossible. Like, they didn't have a way out unless they ditched their life jacket. But then that's another problem. Like, are you really prepared to ditch your life jacket? You don't know if there's obstacles when you swim out from under. You don't know if you're even strong enough to make the swim. What happens if you get stuck down below? Like, there's all these factors that sort of forced the group under the boat to do nothing and wait and just bang the underside of the boat. And so Mark, out on the outside with his group of 6 people, including himself, they actually climbed on top of the flipped upside down boat. The boat was big enough that he knew their extra weight would not cause it to sink any further or create a worse problem for those under the water. He just knew he had to get those people out of the water to avoid hypothermia. And then once they were all up there, Mark found one of the people he was with, their cell phone, despite being submerged, was still working. And so Mark took the phone, he called authorities and said, "You gotta send somebody out here right now. We have people trapped in the water. We need your help." Authorities said they would be out there as soon as possible. And sure enough, authorities were able to get out to the boat fairly quickly. And they were able to get Mark and the 5 others that were trapped on top of the capsized vessel to safety. And then divers were sent into the water and they went underneath the boat. And sure enough, the 5 others, Diana included, they were all still there. But unfortunately, all 5 were deceased. However, those 5 didn't die from hypothermia. They didn't die from drowning. When the boat was actually hit by the whale and capsized, it caused some of the gasoline lines to rupture. And so there was this leak in the gasoline lines. And when the boat was upside down, that leak was basically pouring into the air pocket. The dark, freezing cold, loud, awful air pocket they were in was basically filling with toxic gasoline fumes. And ultimately, 17 minutes after capsizing, all 5 died from gasoline poisoning. On Sunday, November 6th, 2022, a 21-year-old man named Yevgeny Titov walked out of his home in a small city called Zhigulovsk, which is in western Russia. Yevgeny got into his car, and then he drove about an hour and a half north to this parking lot where he parked, and then he got out and walked a few blocks to a nearby train station. When he got there, he asked the person behind the counter when the next train was going to St. Petersburg, and they told him there was one leaving soon. He bought a ticket, and then Yevgeny sat and he waited, and then eventually his train rolled through. He climbed on board, took his seat, and for the next 43 hours, because St. Petersburg was 1,000 miles away, Yevgeny just sat there, basically doing nothing for nearly 2 days. He didn't bring anything with him. He had his wallet. That was it. He just sat there, just waiting to get to St. Petersburg. When they got to St. Petersburg, late on the night of Tuesday, November 8th, Yevgeny, calm as can be, stood up, left the train, and then somehow, possibly by another train or by bus or on foot, or maybe somebody gave him a ride, we don't really know, but he traveled about 15 miles south of that train station to Pulkovo Airport in St. Petersburg. But when he got to the airport, he didn't, board a plane like one would do at an airport. Instead, he found his way to this one very specific parking lot that was outside of the airport. Several hours later, in the early morning hours of Wednesday, November 9th, a random person was on their way through that same parking lot on the way to the airport when they started to hear something. It actually sounded like muffled screaming. And at first, they sort of chalked it up to, lots of people making their way to the airport. Maybe it's a kid, maybe it's, someone goofing around. Like, it didn't seem serious. But as they walked towards this open manhole cover, they realized that the screaming they were hearing was actually coming from inside of this hole in the ground. The screams were from Yevgeny, for reasons that we still do not fully understand. Yevgeny, after taking the manhole cover off, climbed down into this manhole, so he goes deep underground, and then when he reached the bottom of the manhole, which was, relatively wide all the way around, you could stand inside of it, there were these different offshoots of pipes that basically traveled underground. And Yevgeny got down and chose one of these pipes that was only a foot in diameter wide. It's like this pitch black, never-ending seeming tunnel. And head first, he began crawling in this tunnel. And he crawled nearly 40 feet before he finally just couldn't move any further. Keep in mind, every inch he was taking, he's basically wedging himself deeper and deeper into this pipe. It isn't like it was big and then got narrow. No, it's this narrow pipe that he forced himself through until he just could not move any farther. And it was at that point, in the wee hours of Wednesday, November 9th, that Yevgeny began to scream. And that's when the person found him. And authorities would go down inside the manhole, and somehow or another, after many hours and all the specialized equipment, they actually would, somewhat unbelievably, pull Yevgeny out of the pipe, and he would survive. Yevgeny would have to actually be hospitalized because he sustained very severe skin damage from basically thrusting himself deeper and deeper into this rusty, awful pipe. He also sustained gas poisoning and hypothermia, but again, he did live. Following this ordeal, authorities would launch an investigation into what exactly happened here, because there was no clear reason why Yevgeny would have traveled all this way to go into this pipe. But when they spoke to Yevgeny after he made his recovery, after he was back to normal, he would just say he has absolutely no memory of doing any of it.